If your church is still traditional enough, perhaps you still sing those good old-fashioned hymns. Some of them are quite old. Amazing Grace was written in the late 18th century, and many of them date back to that time. But if you want a truly old hymn, or perhaps even an ancient hymn, well, you have to go all the way to the book of Amos. Our hymn books have nothing on the age of Amos's ancient hymn. Back in 1956, an article was published, and the author is J.D.W. Watts. And while not everyone agrees, as scholars often do disagree, this article has stood the test of time, and it's still cited in modern commentaries. So we're going to draw from that as we go through three portions of Amos's book and look at an ancient hymn in Amos. So this is a modern commentary by Douglas Stewart, 2002. That's the Word Biblical Commentary series, and Stewart does a lot with Hebrew meter. So whenever you get into poetic verse throughout the Minor Prophets, for example, he'll really draw that out, show you what the meter is, and expound on the structure and the form of these passages. So if anyone would refer to the work of people like Watts, it would certainly be him. And Stewart says, Verse 13 of Amos 4, by reason of its cadenced employment of participial clauses. Now, I know that everyone gets really excited when you see something like participial clauses, but try to stay calm. Don't make a fool of yourself, that kind of thing. Stay composed. We'll get through this, and you'll see why this is important. But he says it's been recognized by scholars since 1917 as hymnic in style. And then he mentions these three passages, and these are what we're going to go through in Amos 4:13, 5, 8, 9, 5 through 6. You'll see that Watts is going to expand on these. But he says, these may each be fragments of an early Yahwistic hymn. Okay, so what we're going to do now is look at each of these three passages. The first passage will take just a little bit of time to work through to get sort of the flow for how this analysis goes, and then the other two will move quickly, and then we'll close out with a really good quote from Watts on this. So our first passage is Amos 4:13. For behold, he who forms the mountains and creates the wind and declares to man what is his thought, who makes the morning darkness and treads on the heights of the earth. The Lord, the God of hosts, is his name. Now back to participles. Watts says participles, characteristic of hymnic measure, are found here with a highly formal refrain. Yahweh God of hosts is his name. So what is he talking about with these participles? Well, if you actually go back to our passage that we started with in 4:13, I have the participles in red. So you can see forms, creates, declares, makes, treads. Especially if you're reading this in Hebrew, you're going to be reading through Amos, and then you're hit with participle after participle. Okay, and with some imagination, perhaps you can even imagine a cadence in English. For behold, he who forms the mountains, creates the wind, declares to man, makes the morning darkness, treads on the heights of the earth, and so forth. And then the refrain is perhaps a bit more easily distinguished. The Lord, the God of hosts, is his name. And this is something that we're going to see in the other two passages as well. Now, this hymnic fragment in 4:13 is strengthened by looking at the previous verse in Amos 4:12. Therefore, thus I will do to you, O Israel, because I will do this to you. Prepare to meet your God, O Israel. Now you say, okay, what's so significant about that? How does that factor into this concept of an ancient hymn? Well, Watts explains it has to do with repetition. There's a repeated phrase in this verse. I have it in bold now. Therefore, thus I will do to you, O Israel, because I will do this to you. Prepare to meet your God, O Israel. And you can see that this is a match in Hebrew as well. This is an imperfect first person, so I will do, and then the verb asa right here. So I will do to you, and I will do to you. And this is followed by an imperative. Therefore, thus I will do to you, O Israel, because I will do this to you. Prepare to meet your God. Okay, so we have two repeated phrases, and then we have an imperative. Watts says, the first of these clearly brings the Yahweh word of Amos to its climax, while the second rephrases it, making the transition to what follows. The latter appears to be a quotation which was used to support the prophet's point. The last part of verse 12, this imperative call to assembled Israel, belongs to the quotation. Such an imperative is a common characteristic of Hebrew hymns and is therefore quite an appropriate element of the hymnic portion. So let's take what Watts just said and actually kind of see how this fits into Amos 4:12. We have the climax of the Lord's oracle, therefore thus I will do to you, O Israel. And then we have this transition, because I will do this to you. This is the repeated element. And then we have the imperative, prepare to meet your God, O Israel. And so this imperative begins the hymn strophe. And now we're ready to look at the hymn itself, beginning with the imperative, so common in Hebrew hymns. Prepare to meet your God, O Israel. And then we have these participles in bold. So the imperatives and the participles are in bold. He who forms the mountains, creates the wind, declares to man, makes the morning darkness, and treads on the heights of the earth. And then the refrain, the Lord, the God of hosts, is his name. It seems to be a complete whole from its imperative introduction, which calls upon Israel to prepare to encounter her God, through the participial descriptions of him, to the refrain, which in festal emphasis pronounces his name. Well, now that we have kind of a feel for how this works, we'll move on a bit more quickly through the second passage, Amos 5:6-8. 9 also could be included, but it's a bit less sure. So we'll just look at Amos 5:6-8. Once again, participles and imperatives in bold. Seek the Lord and live, lest he break out like fire in the house of Joseph, and it devour, with none to quench it for Bethel. So this would be our list of participles now. Quench it for Bethel, you who turn justice to wormwood, he who made the Pleiades and turns the deep darkness into morning, who calls for the waters of the sea and pours them out on the surface of the earth, and then the refrain, the Lord is his name. Watts says the first line is composed of 3 elements, of 3 accents, each characterizing God's control of heavenly bodies and the sequence of day and night. When he's talking about accents, think about meter, think about stressed syllables. This second line has 2-3 accent elements, telling his control of the rain. At the end is the short refrain, familiar already from our first hymn fragment in 4:13, but here in a shortened form, Yahweh is his name. Now Watts refers to rephrasing verse 7 of Amos chapter 5 with a singular subject. When this is done, it naturally forms a very intimate part of the hymn. The previous verse, and that would be verse 6 of Amos 5, like 4:12c, is an imperative, which is quite at home in a hymnic setting. So we can look at these first and second hymn fragments in comparison. We have duplication, imperative, participles, and we're looking for that hymnic measure as well, and then the refrain. And we have all of those elements between our first and second hymn fragments. So let's look at the third. And this one is Amos 9:5-6. Now this begins with the Lord God of hosts. So it begins with the divine name. The others have not. So that's a bit different. We'll comment on that later. It still does end with the refrain. The Lord is his name. We also have the participles in bold again. Touches the earth, those who dwell in it mourn. He builds his upper chambers in the heavens, who calls for the waters of the sea and pours them out on the surface of the earth. And, of course, our refrain. Now, we've been looking at duplication in these first 2 hymn fragments. Now we're in the third. Notice how the duplication happens at this point. It goes back to one of the prior hymn fragments. This is really fascinating. Amos 9:6b, this is the duplication, 9:6b and 5:8c. Both of them calls for the waters of the sea and pours them out on the surface of the earth. So the duplication ties back to one of the previous hymn fragments. Watts says, these duplications do not connect the words of the hymn with those of Amos like the earlier instances. They rather show the relation of the 2 fragments to each other. Evidently, the fragment in chapter 5 and 9 are from the same hymn, so that one line might be used in 2 places. Now we talked about the divine name begins the hymn fragment in chapter 9 of Amos, and Watts comments very insightfully on that as well. He says the first strophe only reveals the name at the end. The second has it in the first line as an object of an imperative, while this last begins with it as subject. This builds a deliberate climax. And so this is what Watts is talking about. We talked about our third actual hymn fragment starts with the Lord God of hosts. Amos 5 does as well, but there it's the object of an imperative. It's not the subject. And then we started in Amos chapter 4, where the Lord, the God of hosts, is his name. So the divine name starts as a refrain, and then secondly, it's used as the object of an imperative. And then in the last hymn fragment, it's the subject itself and the refrain. So it builds towards a climax. There is some masterful composition at work here in the book of Amos. Let's close with this quotation from Watts. The emphasis and direction of the hymn is obvious. No room is left for the recognition of an intermediate being acting in Yahweh's service. He himself is not only Supreme Lord, but he is the only supernatural power controlling all these things. This is radical Yahwism in the clearest expression possible, denying the existence or power of all the forces known to Canaanite and kindred religions. Yahweh stands supreme and alone, independent of ritual, gracious in intent, revealing his purposes to men, demanding only to be honestly sought in worship, but prepared to wreak awful judgment upon those refusing his invitation. All this is what the singer understood by the name Yahweh, God of hosts. So continue to enjoy those good old-fashioned hymns, but remember, they have nothing on the age of the ancient hymn in Amos. Thanks for watching.